Welcome to Furthering Christendom. I'm your host, Dr. Tyler McNabb, and I'm here with a special guest today, Dr. Matthew Ramage from Benedictine University. How you doing today?
Excellent, Tyler. It's good to get ready to talk some faith and science after a long day of teaching other subjects. Switch it up a bit.
What were you teaching today?
The Church and World Religions all afternoon, and then a class on the papacy and new evangelization in the morning.
I actually have something I might want to send your way to hear your thoughts on regarding Christology of religion stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, do.
I'd be interested in hearing that. On the topic, though, we're talking about a book that came out last summer. For those who are not familiar with it, From Dust to the Earth, of the Earth, Benedict, the Bible, and the Theory of Evolution. So this book is pretty unique in the case that a lot of kind of Catholic controversies that relate to evolution and science and hermeneutics. Matthew gets into the nitty-gritty details of all this. And so really good stuff. Definitely recommend. But our viewers might not all be like me. So I'm a neo-Darwinian card-carrying type of person myself. I really like the kind of Darwinian paradigm and its explanatory abilities. But someone watching this maybe from a more traditionalist background might be less inclined to that. Can you just kind of give us some motivation for thinking that maybe evolution as a theory is getting at truth here?
Yeah, I think even beginning with just the basic concept that evangelizing the culture, which is one of my main shticks, is requiring us to engage the issues of the day. And this is certainly one of them. It's one of the biggest challenges, of course, the faith has faced in a long time. And like Pope Benedict said, you have to have the courage to embrace the full breadth of reason, and all truth is of the Holy Spirit, like Aquinas says. So I always encourage my students to just consider, first of all, even if you have atheists who promote this, it doesn't mean it's atheistic. But yeah, as for the specific question, there's so many different areas. We've all heard the saying, at least those of us who studied it, that nothing in biology makes sense apart from evolution. And really, once you start studying it, I was a biochem major for a while, and I switched and went to theology and all that stuff, seminary. But it's something I've kept up on the last 20 plus years. And it's just remarkable how many strands of evidence there are that every single one of them converges upon evolution. Like Newman said, you're an epistemology guy, so like the convergence of evidences, the accumulation of probabilities, any single line of evidence, you could say, well, that's not really conclusive, like the fossil record or whatnot. But when you take them all together, they all point toward life having a 3.5 billion year old history, the universe being roughly 14 billion years old. And we're talking, I don't know if you want to go into specific strands of this, but of course the fossil record, right? You're never going to have a perfect documentation of every fossil, but we can trace whale evolution. Not only can we trace how life went to land from water, we can look at how whales evolved going backwards from a land creature that resembled a hippo. And it's pretty remarkable. Or even humans in Africa, we can trace what we call hominins, the early forms of humans, from Homo erectus 2 million years ago, who first stood upright, to Lucy, the Australopithecines, and 3 million years ago, to the Neanderthals and us, and just how the beauty of that. And we can go on and on and on. And then, you look to the comparisons across our anatomy. I nerd out about this stuff, Tyler. But think about whale flippers they're really hands. They have the same fundamental structures as us. They're mammals, and they lactate and everything. And you can look at the comparisons across these, and you can start to draw bushes. It's not like a one line, but it's a bush of family inheritance. So you think, well, the humans, we didn't evolve from monkeys. We shared a common ancestor. We most recently split from chimps about 7 million years ago. And genetics is actually the most compelling reason to believe this, which, as you know, when we were in college, the human genome wasn't even mapped. And they were working on it when I was in college as a biochem major in 2000. But now it's just remarkable. There's a book I recommend to people called Adam and the Genome, where he puts it in as lay of terms as you can. and you can walk down gene after gene, chromosome after chromosome, and you can actually trace comparing humans and then chimps, orangutans, gorillas, and you can see where the mutations happen on each gene, and how in the case of the olfactory, humans progressively lose our ability to smell well, for the better, in my opinion, because I don't smell dirty diapers. And some of us have it better than others, like I'm better than my wife. Or in the case of ear movers, my dad was able to move his ears, and I can't do it. I didn't get that gene apparently, or I didn't actualize it. But you have, speaking of which, one of my favorites, Tyler, is the whole idea of atavisms, old genes that reactivate, and like you've probably seen, maybe viewers have not, humans with tails. Because what you have sometimes is with an atavism is you have the old DNA that's largely been corrupted, and sometimes it reactivates and
sneaks back in.
Yeah, chickens with teeth. I have chickens. I like to say I own dinosaurs.
Yeah.
Or have dinosaurs as my pets. And then you think of the vestigial organs, right? Like, why does your hair stand up? That all used to have a utility to it, which does not anymore. And then just one more cool one, because I like to nerd out about these things, is so I live near the Missouri River.
Okay.
And it was Pennsylvanian era, roughly 350 million years ago, give or take a few. It was a shallow sea. And one of my favorite pastimes now is to go down and fossil hunt. And you can find seashells there.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and like in Utah, you can find dinosaurs and
right.
So what you have is biogeography and plate tectonics wasn't even a known until fairly recently in history. And now you can trace the movement of the continents and why are tomatoes a New World plant? Although we think of Italian food as tomatoes, they actually got it from our continent. And basically you piece all these things together, and really the alternative to evolution is that it just so happens it looks like it evolved. And you can always say God put everything there to trick us. St. John Henry Newman is a great one. I don't know if you've read much of him on evolution, but of course he's living at the time of Darwin, and when there's much less evidence. But he apparently had someone he was talking with who thought that God put the fossils in the rocks to test our faith. I've heard this before from people.
Yeah, right.
But he said, look, you basically you've given up on reason. You've given up on the integrity of the human rational enterprise at that point. It's not that God couldn't have done it. And I think that's the issue. It's not what God could have done. It's what is most fitting and what did he actually do.
Right.
But I'm gentle with people because, like you said so well, people may not believe it. The church has not defined it. The church is never going to say you have to believe it.
Right. Well, let's get into that then. So when we're talking about the church, when we're talking about Christianity, or specifically Catholicism, is there anything like at odds with evolution? Is there anything such that maybe we can't fully embrace a Darwinian picture of the world? If you go ahead and speak to that, that'd be helpful.
I think mainly if it's taken in an atheistic or naturalist way, right? And so if you think that evolution implies no God, that's all and pretty clearly. And yet, in terms of media perception, that view I think has won out.
Yeah, that's right.
Culture.
That's right.
We let people like the new atheists back, 20 years ago, Richard Dawkins and people dictate. And my experience, partly maybe because I live in Kansas and we're kind of famous for anti-evolution, but is people then buy into that claim that evolution is against God, and so they take the bait. Right. Whereas I'm more of a Thomist by background, and we believe in primary and secondary causality, and God works through creatures. So for most Thomists, we just don't have a problem with the essence of it, because to create babies, we do the same thing. I mean,
right.
Psalm 139.
Still say God created, our child, whatever.
Right. And yet you can't be an atheist about it. So that's the main thing. Yeah,
I like and planning is where the conflict really lies. I like his emphasis on randomness, and how randomness is not a philosophical term, right? But rather it's a descriptive term where there's no physical mechanism within the organism that's dictating the next mutation. And so since God's not a physical mechanism,
yeah,
we can completely say, you know, random mutation occurs. That's not a philosophical thesis. That's like a biological observation.
And talking to philosophers is great. And I have a mere bachelor of philosophy, but because in philosophically there with that whole concept, you know, I think Plantinga makes a good point in that book also, many points, but where he says that actually evolution itself undermines naturalism.
That's right. That's
right. How, like, if you really take an atheistic version of naturalism, you could probably explain it better, but essentially if all the mind and the soul, or whatever you want to call it, is a product of matter and chance mutations, then there's no reason to believe it's true. It's just more of like an emotion, and therefore your claim that evolution is true is itself not knowable. Right,
yeah. Why trust cognitive faculties that have come about through random mutation, winnowed through natural selection, winnowed by natural selection? You know, why trust them? Especially when it comes to really complex matters, right? Like doing high-level metaphysics or string theory versus quark theory. It seems not reliable in these regards. What about, so for those who know kind of more of the Catholic X, and by X I mean Twitter, of course. You know, you'll see the kind of the gist of debate here oftentimes revolves around two things, at least from my perception. One, the Catholic Church, they'll say, has unanimously interpreted Genesis 1 and 2 in a literal historical fashion. And secondly, they'll appeal to like Pius XII's comments about monogenism and that needing to affirm monogenism as opposed to polygenism. So that's the view, as I understand it, that we, all humans, have come about through Adam biologically as his progeny. Polygenism being that maybe Adam represented all of humanity, but we don't all need to biologically come from him. Is that right? Does Pope Pius XII, do his comments kind of rule out polygenism, or do we have to all affirm monogenism?
Oh man, yeah. Humani Generis 1950 is actually quite the great document that's been abused. But just for readers who, hearers who don't know this, he kind of for the first time officially opens the door to you can accept evolutionary theory with the caveats. One mainly being you can't say the soul evolved, right? That there's something in man that didn't evolve. But other than that, he's okay with human evolution and evolution broadly. You get the feel that he's almost rooting against it, but he's okay with it. And Pius XII also did the similar thing with modern biblical scholarship. It's quite remarkable how modernist, quote unquote, he could be construed as.
Right.
And then the polygenism, he says it's in no way apparent how that's reconcilable with the faith because it's unclear how original sin would be transmitted. Mm-hmm. And I do want to answer that. I think even backing up a bit, though, like the more fundamental thing for a person who's like on the fence about this topic would be if one accepts that recent popes are actually popes.
Right.
That's not guaranteed anymore. But if they accept that, then John Paul and Benedict all the time affirmed evolution.
Right.
So one of my favorite, the early lines was John Paul called it, quote, more than a hypothesis. And Benedict spoke of many proofs of it. They just published this. Of course, this is my book back here, but this book from Ignatius, The Divine Project, is magnificent. It's a set of talks, kind of goofily enough, I translated from German for my book because it wasn't in English. And then Ignatius puts it out right after he dies. But he says in there that you can't say creation or evolution. You need to say creation and evolution. Right. Because they're philosophically on different levels. Like evolution is describing the empirical mechanisms, but creation refers to God giving being to creatures who in Thomistic sense move themselves. But yeah, like once you say that other popes have, accepted this, then it's clear that Pius isn't saying evolution's wrong. And I know people don't usually care, but the Pontifical Council, which one is it for? I can't remember which one it was, but it was the document Dialogue and Proclamation, where it actually says that evolution has been virtually demonstrated.
Mm.
But anyway, besides that, with the polygenism, one important thing that I actually learned researching my book for years was the polygenism that Pius was really concerned about was the then contemporary, think just after Nazism, multiple origin theory of different human races arose on different continents.
Right.
And that was the view he ruled out, and correctly so. And not that he didn't definitively rule it out, but he said it's hard to square. And it would be very hard to square. In fact, now it's very hard to square scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
We just did not arise on different continents. And that was used as an excuse for racism, social Darwinism. And so thankfully the science aligns with church teaching, as it always ends up doing. And so in that sense, polygenism is wrong. Now, you have a more complicated thing that's pretty interesting, and I don't know how much you've followed this, but so Homo sapiens has been around at least a couple 100,000 years. And then now we're tracking, I mean, we can tell Neanderthals had art. In the Smithsonian, I've seen Neanderthal jewelry, and now you have more recent discoveries like Homo naledi that appears to have possibly buried their dead and had rudimentary cave art 300,000 years ago. And some scholars, anthropologists, paleobiologists, think that Homo erectus 2 million years ago may have already harnessed fire and went deep into caves with it. And so there's a possibility that Adam goes way back.
Mm.
And so it's fascinating that with original sin, you can still go with monogenism in that there was maybe one first human, the first one to have the last set of mutations that made possible the spiritual soul to be infused. But in any way you cut it, any way you slice it, it's not biblical literalism, because we're talking anywhere between 200,000 years ago or 2 million years ago.
Right. And so the idea there is, he has, they have a kid, right? The first man, first woman have a kid, and biologically, human, but then I guess they mate, their child mates with someone who's not quite a human, but almost, and then they have children, and then those children are humans. Is that that's the kind of picture you're painting, right?
One picture, yeah. And because you have basically two quandaries. On the one hand, if you don't have evolution, let's just say you have two first parents created and their genome looks like they evolved, that would be a weird way to do things, but God could trick you, I guess. Then you're going to have incest to populate.
Right. Exactly.
That's genetically problematic. We've learned that through Habsburgs and people. On the other hand, to like what you're almost getting us to is that you could see how, okay, well, the first person to be truly human would have to mate with a non-human or whatever, right? So you get, but someone who's done great work on this is Kenneth Kemp up at University of St. Thomas. And he has some stuff you guys can view on the internet for those out there interested in this. But what you see is however long it took, however different the first, let's say, truly human looked, it's not like bestiality where they're mating with a pig or even a chimp. Right. They really are biologically compatible. So what Kemp does is he distinguishes a couple different things, but one of them is he calls it like a theological human from a merely biological one. I think there's some merit to that. Maybe it's not the only way to go, but it's not a different species biologically.
Right.
And this is a bit edgy, but hey, it's a podcast. It's not entirely clear that there has to be a night and day difference between them either. I think that's the general view of monogenism is there, even if you have evolution in it, there's a night and day difference between mom and dad and the baby. I have my serious doubts that that's the way it was. And yet there is strong evidence that, you know, people put forward that language is all or nothing. And that may be. So there's a few different scenarios you could have in there. For that view, for readers interested, that it's all or nothing, but more or less follows the same lines, the Thomistic evolution group, headed by Father Nicanor Austriaco, does a wonderful job on that. So what I end up doing for Catholics, and this is St. Augustine's principle that I think is the money, is you have to go back to unity in essentials, liberty in doubtful matters, and charity in all things. So what I do in my book a little bit, even though I'm really convinced of one view, is I say, look, here's a few different views you can have. And in my teaching, I'll even say you can be a direct creationist, and that's within the bounds of Catholic. I think it's going to be leading people away from the faith, like Augustine would say, to deny the evidence. But you could take a number of views in here, as long as you don't reduce the human soul to the mere material or exclude God from the process.
Right. So do you think that then that we can endorse polygenism? So say like there's kind of like a horn, a dilemma, right? Where, on one horn, it's like you have to advocate for incest.
Yeah,
and no, I don't want incest. Well, then it's like, well, I have to advocate for bestiality, right?
Yeah.
And of course, you've told us that, hey, there might be a demarcation between theologically a person and biologically a person. We're still talking about human beings biologically, just not theologically. But let's say you just want to avoid all this together. You're just like, I don't want either option. Can I go ahead and affirm polygenism?
Not multiple continent polygenism in a way. But if you want to say, but let's just say this. Ratzinger was okay with a version of it.
Okay.
Usually if Ratzinger says it, it's good enough for me. Now he doesn't say this as Pope, because as Pope, he explicitly said he didn't want to weigh in on theoretical matters.
Yeah.
But if it was a version of it that, look, you had a line evolve and die out. There's a similar thing, like, did Paul write letters that we don't have anymore? Probably.
Right.
That I don't see how that's excluded, because on John Paul II's principles, the faith shouldn't be dictating scientific evidence to science. He spoke of their mutual autonomy and their mutual purification. But I mean, just speaking, frankly, I don't see how the faith can preemptively say there weren't multiple lines.
Right.
But what we have, as far as I can tell, being trained only at the bachelor's level in these fields and an avid reader of them, is it sure looks like there's ultimately a common line.
Right.
And so that's actually theologically more simple and neat. But I love the theoretical question anyway that you asked. Right?
No, that's the interesting part of, I don't know how much if you've looked into William Craig's work on this stuff that came out, I think after yours, maybe.
I read part of that book.
Kind of converges on the same sort of theses.
And it's been a year or so since I read that. It's with the First Things article, and then I bought the book. But I think in the book, something like he put it at around 750,000 years ago is where he wanted to make that point. And fair enough, whether that's the line or not. It was really refreshing to read Craig's book, because he's a strong evangelical, right? And he said, look, no, here's the evidence. So, and then the other thing about the science is it's open to revision. It's not science if it's not willing to be questioned. So the great thing about the church not defining anything is we could punt the date older. We could discover, oh my gosh, there were Homo sapiens in Europe 3 million years ago. And that's all things that we could possibly learn. But fundamentally, that God works through the natural processes of evolution. I think if you apply Augustine's saying in Aquinas, you may disagree, and fair enough, but don't make the faith look ridiculous to others and prevent their belief. As their line of thinking.
So let me kind of summarize what I think what's being said. I just want to make sure I got everything accurate. So looks like scientifically, the idea that we do come from an original pair, so to speak, is actually looking more and more respectable, so to speak, in the scientific community. However, if one's just kind of convinced that polygenism is the correct view, then perhaps what one can do is say, well, maybe the polygenism that's condemned is kind of a racial polygenism and a materialistic polygenism. And so we should be somewhat open. Even I believe you say in your book that when Ratzinger was head of this kind of pontifical council, right? He looked at this and it seemed like they were not condemning polygenism, at least immediately.
that document, I just taught Dialogue and Proclamation, Communion and Stewardship, or whatever it's called. I've taught it a million times now. I'm blanking on the name, but it says, and this is almost a verbatim quote, the origin of persons, whether as individuals or as groups.
Yes.
So that's the line you're probably even thinking of.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's certainly within bounds. Again, unless you want to go down and say the CDF or the pontifical councils are heretical. I get it when people have problems with stuff being said by the Vatican, but I think once you go down that path, you're pretty far down into schismatic territory. Yeah. But then again, it's not being spoken as infallible, so it's not requiring the assent of faith. Yeah. But I think either way, again, you're not at a literalistic reading. You're at a figurative, as the Catechism would say. So let's just say there were two first parents. I mean, the one is more likely than the two, because to have these things happen at the same time is pretty unlikely. But even then, I try to help students realize what you're not doing is saying Eve came from the guy's literal rib. Right. You're not saying that God took dirt, and sometimes they don't realize that the reading they've come up with is actually quite a non-literal reading. So I try to help them be consistent with that. Right.
Well, then that gets to the prior question before the polygenism question about, is what do you say to those who are like, oh, no. All bishops in communion with Rome have always interpreted Genesis 1 and 2 in a literalistic way.
Oh no, I encounter that one. I mean, first of all, it's just not true, factually. My area is dogmatics and scripture, not church history, although we all have to have some competence in it. So I don't know every last thing ever said. But Augustine certainly didn't think like that. Origen didn't think like that. Two of the arguably most important influences on the Western tradition didn't think that. So they don't all take it that literally. Augustine has the 7 days, as you probably know, being symbolic. But I would, to their point, I would acknowledge that as far as I can tell, they all pretty much thought there was one first human. And fair enough. I think that's worth granting. Here's my reply to that. Not that it's not my business to convince people who don't want to be convinced, but they also thought the Earth was the center of the solar system and the universe. So their scientific views were not desirable by today's standards.
Well, then that's when you go down the really tratty road, and all of a sudden,
yeah. Like if you're consistent, I've known only one guy who was actually a geocentrist.
Yes.
And hey, at least he's consistent.
One man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens.
Boom. Yeah. No, but seriously, once you say every church father thought blank scientifically, here's what Ratzinger spent 50 years trying to do. And this applies to every biblical topic. He got down to what is the essential point. He sometimes calls it the kernel versus what is the accidentals, what's the vehicle or shell. And so he was just perfectly okay, both as priest, bishop, and pope, with the church not fully knowing the scientific details or even getting them wrong.
Right.
And because those are changeable over time. But so if people in their heads really thought the first guy came from dust and didn't understand that was a symbol for our connection to the earth and our mortality, no harm done to their souls.
Right.
But scientifically, we can grow in our understanding, and that's okay.
That's good. Yeah. That's good. What about kind of just Genesis in general? So I don't know if you're familiar with, so before I went the philosophy route, I was on my track to try to become like an Old Testament scholar. And
I
so,
don't think I knew that. No.
yeah, Brevard Childs and John Sailhammer were like my boys.
Oh, yeah.
And Sailhammer has this nice kind of account of Genesis where it's not about the creation of the cosmos. Like that's in Genesis 1:1, but generally like what it's talking about is the Eretz, the land, the creation of Eden.
Yeah.
And so yeah, any curious if you've given that any thought.
A ton. In fact, so Ratzinger does more of the archetypal interpretation that Adam is every human being. I think that's a good interpretation. He only does a little bit on this. So in my book, I try to supplement this with Old Testament contemporary scholarship.
Yeah.
But if this is the same thing you're talking about, Adam is Israel.
Right.
And Eden is the Eretz, the Holy Land.
That's right.
In fact, land and earth being the same word in the Hebrew, it's fascinating when you look at Jeremiah.
Yes.
Jeremiah looks out at the land, and behold, the land is formless and void.
Yep.
So, you know, the Pentateuch especially, people have a whole debate over this, but some of the material is older than Moses. Some of it is way after Moses. But regardless, as Childs would say, I think, if you read it canonically, the whole thing, you have to be read together, and it's a post-exilic compilation.
Right.
So, you know, regardless of how old the original material of Genesis 1 and 2 is, if you go through, I have like a couple pages in my book on this, but Adam and Israel, they both share in common. They're both specially created directly, and they are in a land where God walks, and they walk with God. They're given a special law. And it so happens, as one of my students taught me, so to speak, through a seminar, she said, she was actually Jewish by background, it's a dietary law, Dr. Ramage. And I've been, now the past, 10 years, this has stuck with me. Do not eat the fruit is a dietary law. It's a kosher law.
Right.
You know, and they're both told to till and keep and subdue. Those are all words of language in Leviticus that are for priestly service of the tabernacle. And then, of course, they both die. I like how the Old Testament scholar and popular writer Peter Enns puts it. He said, well, they die, only they don't. Only they do. Right? Like, because the death is exile, spiritual death. And then with the Israelites, they break the law of God and they die by getting exiled. So I think on the literal sense, Adam is Israel, but I don't believe that precludes him being the first man and every man. So as far as I can tell, my best take on this is that the inspired author is a genius, and he has Adam being Israel, but then it's not a giant leap to all mankind to say this is the human condition as such. And as Ratzinger says, we're all Adam.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you take it that Ratzinger did endorse a historical Adam?
To this extent, well, let me give you a couple of quotes. I'll botch them a bit, but teaching enough years, hopefully I got them kind of right. And it goes like this, that the Adam tells us no more about the first man than he does about every man. That's pretty hardcore, actually. And then he has Adam is the archetypal man. So he clearly sees Adam as symbolic, but he also affirms original sin.
Right.
So I think if you had to ask him, we'll see if we get to heaven someday and do that. But I think he would say that Adam represents the first man, but the catechism that he edited says it contains real events and figurative language.
Right.
So I think he, at least this is me, let me speak for myself. I'm, as for the amount of detail we know about the historical video camera record, probably very little. but that there was original sin in the first human generation
Right.
seems pretty essential, and even knowing the way we are, pretty expected.
Yeah, yeah.
But
So you think
yeah,
maybe kind of like mytho-history, there's kernels of historical truth, namely, hey, listen, the first generation of human beings, they sucked.
yeah,
and
yeah,
that caused tension in the cosmos. Um,
yeah,
but nonetheless, it's kind of mythologized, so to speak.
yeah. And if I may, on the mythologized, one beautiful thing of Ratzinger is he shows how Genesis 1 through 11, he actually, and John Paul said this too, it's mythology, but it's also anti-mythology. And they've not read Tolkien probably, but Benedict was a fan of Chesterton, and Chesterton, Lewis, and Tolkien all see this as like the inspired myth, right? The chosen
Right.
mythology. And in that robust sense, not of a falsehood, but of a deeper understanding of reality through imagery rather than through, well, analytic philosophy, right?
Right.
And
Right.
both are valid, but
Right. Right.
and once you grasp that, all these objections kind of, in some sense, fade away, because you realize you're not trying to do Thomistic, objections and answers here.
Right. Right. Exactly. You're telling narratives in a narrative way, in a
Yeah,
mythological way, that are expressing truths that are existential and important and real, but nonetheless through this art, so to speak.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, go
well,
ahead.
wonderful. Well, what do you, if you want to, we can wrap things up by asking you, what are you working on now, or what are your future projects that you see?
Oh yeah. Working on a book that's sort of an intro to Benedict's thought, but also the thing I've been working on the past 2 years is, well, I don't have this firm title for it yet, but it's basically Care for Creation from an
Oh,
authentically Catholic point of view.
nice.
And the book I'm writing, I kind of have a draft of it, is tentatively titled "And with Every Creature That Is With You, the Ecological Thought of Pope Benedict XVI." And the every living creature with you, the reason for that, and we'll see what the publisher, if I get a publisher, ends up wanting, but as they exit the ark, God just repeats time and time and again the covenants with every creature with
Uh-huh.
you. So it really got me thinking, as I was put in co-charge of our college's Center for Integral Ecology a few years back, that we don't, well, at least I don't think the Catholic Church wants animal rights language. It's not the way to go. They're not persons, but also we shouldn't be trashing the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you consider, wait, we have a covenant with creatures, it takes on a more familial kinship bond
Yeah,
approach. And it really does change the picture. So it's trying to articulate an authentically Catholic approach to care for creation. And, John Paul spoke of human ecology, that you want to wed together care for earth ecology with also the most vulnerable humans, including the unborn, human ecology.
right.
Whereas, frankly, to put it bluntly, in secular environmentalism is often anti-human.
Right. Yeah.
But it need not be so. And in fact, this is an area the church needs to reclaim. And John Paul said a lot about it. Of course, Pope Francis has. But the missed thing is my boy, Benedict,
That's it.
wrote enough on it that they published a whole book worth of his compilations.
Nice.
So as usual, what I'm up to is letting people know what he actually said, and then he'll just lay down a theology bomb and not explain it. So trying to explain it and put that into dialogue with other thinkers who can flesh it out more.
Nice.
And that's what I'm doing.
Awesome. Love it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ramage, for coming on today. We really, really appreciate it.
That was great talking, Tyler.